Questioning immersion in contemporary themed and immersive spaces. In the contemporary world, more and more, we are told of the value of becoming immersed in the worlds and spaces around us. Cultural anthropologists, since the days of pioneering fieldworker Bronislaw Malinowski, have understood the deep desirability of appreciating an emic or insider's view of the world that is possible after completing rigorous and often challenging forms of cultural immersion in the field site of study. This describes the method of participant observation, whose anthropologist fieldworker attempted to, quote, grasp the native's point of view, his relation to life, to realize his vision of the world, end quote. Interestingly, the posthumous and controversial publication of Malinowski's diary resulted in the anthropological community confirming what any field worker has likely known all the while in the field, namely that cultural immersion and its many methodological and representational dynamics is an arena of notable contradictions. Malinowski's immersion in his field sites, as reflected in the classic ethnography Argonauts of the Western Pacific, was later contradicted by the expressions in his diary. Disturbing sensibilities, anxieties, and expressions of culture shock in the diary suggested the anthropologist's discomfort with his immersion. Since the days of Malinowski's field work, cultural anthropologists have agreed with his suggestion of getting off the veranda, avoiding the observation of culture from afar, in order to get deeply wrapped up in the culture being studied. The world of consumer spaces has also been influenced profoundly by such notions of immersion. The word immersion etymologically suggests a plunging or dipping into something, or an absorption in some interest or situation. In the contemporary world, particularly in popular culture, media, and consumer spaces, immersion has taken on new and important meanings. As Frank Rose suggests, today's media and consumer world is influenced by new forms of narrative that are participatory and immersive. In theme spaces of the present, immersion involves taking a patron or guest and placing that person directly within the given and typically symbolically marked context of those spaces. Very commonly, narratives or forms of storytelling are used to immerse guests within spaces, as are forms of technology, social media, and many other manners of material media and performative culture. Such spaces exemplify the nature of the experience economy and the dream society, as defined by both Pine and Gilmore, and Rolf Jensen, respectively. Guests who enter any number of spaces today, whether a cruise ship, restaurant, or even a library, are seen not simply as automata who mindlessly move in and use the space, but they are viewed as active participants who often complete the story, experience, or context at hand within the space. Narratives such as these, including be a part of it all, feel like it really feels, have an authentic experience, go out there and do it, among many others, suggests the value of becoming deeply engaged in a space and experiencing all that it offers. These narratives of immersion, whose embodiments often result in forms of pleasure experienced by guests, have been viewed typically by researchers and social critics of the popular as being representative of the many problematic issues of popular culture and associated consumer spaces: hegemony, commodification, hedonism, and related areas. The greater involvement of guests in these spaces, such as at the Cerritos Millennium Library, which was created as the first library to be designed using principles of Pine and Gilmore's experience economy, could be argued to be resultant in various negative effects. This begs the question for this study: is immersion a desirable state in the world? Cults of immersion. Beyond the anthropological and consumer cultural contexts, we may review others in which immersion is considered of fundamental importance to the space at hand. Of course, it is worth noting that each and every space, no matter a theme park, museum, or even office cubicle, may be denoted as an immersive space, with the idea that any space wraps us up within it by the nature of the activity or content specific to that space. We may, however, choose to engage or disengage in the space, its people, ideas, and activities as we desire, and thus we are not necessarily fully engaged in every space of which we are a part. Because some of our engagement with or immersion in particular spaces may be considered unpleasurable, such as here standing in line at the DMV to receive our driver's license, we create other spaces like theme parks to provide an opportunity to immerse ourselves in a more pleasurable space and likely to allow us to forget about the other less pleasurable spaces of our lives. Curiously enough, as I will discuss later, some of the most intriguing immersive spaces in existence, and some perhaps to come, are those that indeed engage us, but often in disturbing, unsettling, avant-garde, and uncanny senses. Most contemporary themed and consumer spaces, however, do not engage the guest at the level of these negative feelings or associations, and instead strive for a pleasurable form of immersion. In my many years working in the theme park industry, I found that while we spoke of engaging the guest in our many theme spaces, we often did not reflect on the nuances of that immersion. In our training department, we instructed employees on the many techniques necessary to engage guests in our spaces, and typically, at least during my years of work at the theme park, we emphasized the idea of movie making as a metaphor for how successful guest immersion might occur. In assessing our employees, we observed and asked questions as to whether their service work, performance, and guest interaction behaviors led to the engagement of the guest in our theme park. But we never asked questions such as these. Should guests be immersed in our theme spaces for the entirety of their visit? What about when they are going to the bathroom? Are there some spaces in context that, akin to the employee backstage, are even out of bounds for the guest? Perhaps meta spaces and meta contexts that supersede or negate the immersive worlds at hand? Our guest relations department did interview guests upon leaving the theme park on a given day, and thus did obtain feedback about guest satisfaction, which could include reflections on guest feelings in regards to how successful the immersive efforts of our employees were. However useful for park operations these forms of feedback were, they did not provide context, at least in terms of this study, as to the nuances of guest immersion. In my research related to this concept, including my work on the Immersive Worlds Handbook, I have come to understand that the concept has been accepted by multiple communities for its simplicity. Social critics and many researchers, when detailing the typical exploits of guests in themed and consumer spaces, offer superficial interpretations of guest behaviors in those spaces. They shop, they enjoy, consume, laugh, and so forth. Similarly, for some designers, trainers, and assessors in the theming industries, there is reliance on oversimplified notions of guest immersion. The guest should feel escape, fantasy, delight, and the like. In both cases, the simplification of how a guest experiences or might at least experience a theme space is remarkable. Cultural anthropologists remind us that the behaviors, attitudes, and existential reflections of individuals in any space are incredibly complex, perhaps too complex to represent in any form, ethnographic or otherwise. In a much different but useful example, in the case of a cult, or more properly a high-demand religious movement, we typically interpret the context of the immersion or engagement of the individual as a negative one. Individuals who leave such groups and are deprogrammed, so to speak of the inherent toxicity of being part of a group whose social and other spaces are incredibly determinant in the lives of group members. We call these groups high demand because they require that individuals give up a good deal, if not all, of their previous social lives in order to engage in the social spaces of the new group. We may then look at the similar context of the total institution Irving Goffman's concept of a space, such as a prison, in which the effects of the space on the individual are total. Each and every aspect of the individual's life are prescribed and enforced by the institution. Again, we might say that in this context, the desirability of the individual to be immersed in such a space is low. But a key point is that the effect of the immersion on that person is often quite high. High-demand groups and prisons are certainly unique and arguably extreme spaces of immersion. But the dramatic nature of their effects on individuals within them reminds us of some significant foundations of immersion. Immersion is always related to the deployment and exercise of symbols. In the case of a prison, the symbolic de-individuation of the prisoner is a key aspect of bringing him or her in line, potentially even resulting in re-socialization of the individual. In the example of the theme park, it is the highly evocative forms of thematic symbols represented in architecture, material cues, types of performance, and other forms that similarly impact how well the individual becomes immersed in the space. In its various modes of effect on individuals, we also note that immersion is socially manifested. Proponents of language immersion programs, for example, emphasize that language is easier to learn if the student surrounds him or herself with the people from the culture who speak the given language. Immersion, then, is context dependent. It is related to the specifics of the space at hand, its uses, activities, and themes. It is also connected to the desires of the individual undergoing immersion, especially as his or her level of connection with the space may vary for any number of reasons. It is also highly dependent on the myriad social relationships that constitute the space. Contemporary alternative spaces like Burning Man and the Black Rock Desert remind us that like-mindedness, similar to Victor Turner's notions of communautés, may result in more positive feelings of mutual engagement in a space. As cultural anthropologists have suggested as a result of their fieldwork, immersion is indeed a mixed bag. In some cases, there is a lack of welcome afforded to the anthropologists attempting to become immersed in a given ethnographic setting. In other cases, the ethnographer might have to disengage from a field setting, sometimes quite abruptly, in order to preserve the political stability of the setting. What cultural anthropology has educated us about in terms of immersion is that it is a multifaceted, nuanced, and indeed highly subjective entity. Of course, anthropologists have a certain luxury in that they may spend a much longer time in a setting and thus have opportunities for deeper sorts of engagement in it as compared to individuals in other settings that reflect a much shorter temporal duration of immersion. As well, anthropologists communicate the dynamics of their field work in ethnographic forms that allow for expressive, detailed, and nuanced considerations of all facets of the field site, including the immersion experienced by the ethnographer. In contrast with these two contexts of ethnographic immersion, the field and the textual, we discover that many spaces of the contemporary consumer world do not allow for similar levels of corporeal or existential engagement. In some cases, such as a ride like Pirates of the Caribbean at Disney theme parks, the entire length of the ride is a mere 15 minutes. While this does not include the length or the immersion of the guest that may occur in spaces related to the ride, such as the queue house, even including these, the time in which guest immersion may occur is relatively brief. Thus, we see the high stakes of guest engagement when it comes to the world of themed spaces. Added to this challenge is the fact that a given guest, as in this particular Disney example, upon leaving Pirates of the Caribbean, moves to a new space, perhaps after leaving other inner spaces that connect rides and attractions or entire theme lands to one another. It may be a strange and uncanny experience for such a guest to shift existentially from all of the feelings, moods, and story effects of Pirates of the Caribbean as he or she then boards It's a Small World. In contrast with other immersive media, like video games and novels, the guest is taken on a series of thematic, conceptual, and contextual turns in which he or she may be unable to make sense of the whole of the experience, either the theme land in question or the entire theme park. Save some postmodern forms of fiction, the reader of a novel is typically able to become wrapped up in the story because of the consistency of the elements, setting, characterization, narrative, and so forth, that has been provided by the author. As we reflect on the fact that immersion is nuanced, subjective, and context-dependent, the question that framed this section, namely, is immersion a desirable state in the world, becomes even more curious. Many advocates of cultural and language immersion programs suggest that a key value, pedagogical and in some cases moral and ethical, of such programs is that they alter radically the perspective of the learner. As some have put it, immersion creates perspective shift in the individual, with the idea being that the preponderance of cultural contexts, experiences, sensations, and activities results in a total effect on that person. Yet, we might ask, what is entirely entailed in such a shift of perspective, and what are its impacts on that individual, intended and unintended? Questioning immersion. Many years ago, I was asked to draw on my experiences as a cultural anthropologist and a researcher of theme parks at an extensive collaborative event held by a major media corporation, what I will refer to today as the workshop. Due to my non-disclosure agreement, I am unable to detail the nature of the event, but I mention it here so as to emphasize the interesting worlds that I have engaged as an anthropologist and themed industry consultant. Notably, my involvement in these worlds, that of theoretical and methodological professional anthropology, professional theme park training, and themed and immersive design consultation, suggests a curious and often contradictory engagement with the concept of immersion. While participating in the workshop, I found myself continually posing queries in the form of internal dialogues. How exactly could I help develop better strategy for the forms of immersion suggested by the company that organized the event? Is it possible to use critical awareness of the issues and problems associated with immersion, such as Plato's Cave, which I will address shortly, in order to fashion new spaces, modalities, and understandings of immersion that are more critical, conceptual, even political? In the midst of this work, I was contacted by a large publisher of practical guidebooks and was asked to write a text that would detail approaches to creating themed and immersive spaces. This work became the Immersive Worlds Handbook, a text that attempted to establish considerations of design practices that could be used to create immersive environments in theme parks, museums, or interpretive centers, and many other spaces. The initial impetus of the text was based on some of the concepts that I had developed for the workshop. One of the daunting tasks of working on the book was to consider a shift from my role as an ethnographer analyst to a practitioner who is advising others on how to create immersive spaces for the guest. I welcome this challenge, especially as my consulting work with some of the major players in the themed amusement industry had allowed me to consider my relationship to themed spaces and new senses. In fact, I eventually formed my own consulting operation that emphasized practical approaches to many of the research, analysis, and design sides of the themed entertainment industry. At the same time, I felt some degree of trepidation as I began to reflect on the notable contradictions between the critical views of immersion and those focused more decidedly on pleasures and experiences of guests in immersive spaces. In the film The Matrix, the viewer is presented with the interesting heuristic of the red and the blue pill. As suggested in the film, and its rumination on a faux and hegemonic world as lurking behind the so-called real, were an individual to take the blue pill, she or he would be allowed to remain in the world of illusion or simulation and experience bliss. Were an individual to take the red pill, he or she would be confronted with the opposite, the stripping away of illusion and fantasy, and in its place, the realization of the harshness of reality. As an allegory, the red and the blue pill reminds of Plato's famous tale of the cave in the Republic. In that particular telling, we see a similar emphasis on the delusional and illusory quality of a themed and immersive space, as the dwellers of the cave know only the reality of what its masters have projected on the walls. Aside from being an important allegory for understanding the contemporary world, both the red and the blue pill and the cave offer an opportunity for an interesting reorientation of the guest and the critic in the world of themed and immersive space. In my own research and practical efforts in terms of the workshop and the Immersive Worlds Handbook, I have noted some curious parallels between the fictional suggestions about immersion in the Matrix and Plato's Cave and the concerns that have been offered in the literature on immersive spaces. One concern that has been expressed is the idea that one is never immersed in any space, whether a consumerist one or a presumably authentic one, such as an ancient church, because one can never fully existentially become one with that space. There will always be a divide between an individual and any space in the world. Of course, this may only suggest that there are levels of engagement or nuance that should be understood in any context in which we consider immersion. A second expression of critique is that one is never able to become immersed in a consumer space because, unlike other spaces, again, the ancient church, the consumer space is emblematic of simulated and therefore inauthentic experiences. This critique relies on antiquated notions of immersion and of the passive, non-acting guest within the immersive space. A third concern is that one is indeed able to be immersed in a consumer space, but he or she is participating in a ruse, a fantasy world created by the culture industry with various economic, political, and other hegemonic intentions. As stated here, the critique would suggest that while immersion is occurring, the outcome of it is inherently negative to the actor. Yet, as relevant as these critiques are, we might imagine a fourth possibility, one that highlights these concerns but also complicates them. Slavoj Žižek, in an interview focused on the Matrix, suggested the need for a third pill in terms of the Matrix's choice of a red and a blue pill. In his mind, this pill would enable one to perceive not the reality behind the illusion, but reality in illusion itself. Referencing Žižek's notion of a third pill, we might imagine the fourth possibility of immersion. In this one, the guest is immersed in a space and thus feels all of the sorts of connections to it as one might, but that guest realizes that his or her experience is partial and contingent, all the time understanding that all spaces, whether themed, consumerist, or otherwise, are constructions that imply fluctuations between active, passive, agent, subject, object, creator, consumer. The guest also realizes that this circumstance is not entirely the doing of the maker or the operator of the space, as social criticism so often implies, but that he or she is complicit in these mixed and ambivalent connections with the space. In this sense, he or she is operating metaphorically at the level of the middle voice, not an agent acting upon or a subject being acted upon, but an individual who is, along with all others, in the midst of things. In the title of this chapter, I have placed in scare quotes quite deliberately the word immersion, so as to suggest the hopelessness of relying on eroded notions of the real, fictive, authentic, inauthentic, original copy. By questioning immersion and all of its contexts, we may become better able to appreciate the complex nature of contemporary themed and consumer space, as well as the experiences that occur within it. We should thus challenge both the guest of any themed space who wishes to have an uncomplicated, seamless, immersive experience in which he or she suspends fully his or her own disbelief and enters the reality of the immersive space, and the social critic who assumes that he or she understands fully the experiences entailed in any form of immersion, whether in a faux space or a real space. As well, we might begin to question the very boundaries that seem to define the immersive from the non-immersive. It would be quite easy for any of us, whether our role be guest, designer, or anthropologist critic, to simply assume our position in relationship to immersion that has been defined for us. Greater dialogue among these actors who represent the sort of collaborative, conflicting roles that I have suggested both in the workshop and the Immersive Worlds Handbook may result in greater understanding of both the nuances of themed and immersive spaces and their varied psychological, existential, and social uses by their many actors. The parables of the Matrix and Plato's cave necessarily simplify the vicissitudes of the real and the fictive. There is neither one real world nor one fictive world. As well, it is difficult, if not impossible, to determine the boundaries between such worlds. As participants in the Jejune Institute discovered, a curious experiment in San Francisco in which participants were not clear on when an extensive real-world game began or ended, certain reflections of the real fictive in today's world suggest the stuff of the existential complexity that we discover in great works of conceptual art, open-ended art film, and other aesthetic forms that eschew clarity, closure, and world definition in favor of complexity, openness, and fabula. Thus, in our questioning of all forms of immersion, whether those of contemporary themed spaces or other spaces and everyday life forms, we should avoid the simplicity that is suggested in an assertion that there is a clear, definable real and an equally identifiable doppelganger of it in the fictive. Avant-garde futures of immersion. In the American television series Fantasy Island, well-to-do visitors found themselves in the remarkable position of having any of their fantasies granted. A starlet who wished to just be anonymous and unknown, an aspiring detective who wanted to solve the case of Jack the Ripper, a bumbling individual who wished to travel back in time to World War I to battle the Red Baron. Viewers of the show were never clear as to how the fantasies were granted to the island's guests by its mysterious Mr. Rourke. And this is precisely what made Fantasy Island an engaging show. The idea that one could be fully immersed in any fantasy space, whether of the past, present, or future. What is more is that on many occasions, the immersive experiences of guests were all too realistic, particularly when their fantasies became so real that they were nearly killed as a result of their participation in them. Mr. Rourke, who likely had supernatural powers, often warned guests of the dangers posed by their fantasies and reminded them that once the fantasies had begun, they could never be stopped. On numerous occasions, Rourke did intervene and save some of the guests from certain peril, an act which was often followed by the guest's realization of some sort of lesson that Rourke had intended. Conceptually, we may view this point of Rourke's intervention in the fantasy world to save the guest as an imposition of the real as it relates to all fantasy and ultimately to all immersive spaces. Other fantasy spaces that, like those of Fantasy Island, are too immersive in their dangerous potentials include the holodeck in the numerous Star Trek series and films, in which an individual could enter an immersive virtual space that could replicate any desired place, time, or context, and the fantasy theme park of the film Westworld, in which gunslinger robots go out of control and attempt to kill the park's guests. As in the case of Fantasy Island, the desires of guests to be immersed in fantasy spaces that often become as real as the real are posed to viewers as being highly problematic. In fact, in some version of Star Trek's holodeck, a safety feature was introduced such that certain virtual recreations, such as dangerous weapons, would either not be created by the computer's simulation systems or would be negated in a circumstance in which the holodeck user might be harmed. This feature suggests, not unlike the many metaphors implied by Plato's cave and the Matrix, that the desire to be immersed in fantasy spaces is not without consequence. Today's academic and cultural critics of the immersive space fulfilled Plato's role of the philosopher who, in the case of the immersive cave, is able, presumably, to see the contradictions between the world of the cave and the outside world, the fictive and the real. As powerful as Plato's parable is today, as well as the many works that have struggled with the implications of the often contradictory worlds of the simulated and the real, we might discover a subtle form of elitism inherent in the idea of the philosopher being able to sort out the complications of these worlds. Like Plato's philosopher, the critic who claims to be able to clearly demarcate the boundaries of fictions and realities, of simulated immersive space versus everyday mundane space, is operating from a position of supremacy. As Slavoj Žižek, Peter Sloterdijk, and others have expressed, the position of the critic is often, at best, ideologically unproblematized, or, at worst, a form of enlightened false consciousness or cynicism. At the same time, returning to the allegories of shows like Fantasy Island, we should acknowledge the many problematic ways in which all of us, whether researchers of themed and immersive spaces or not, are caught up in the complex semiotic, political, and identity webs that are part and parcel of our everyday worlds. Using fictional worlds of immersion as exemplars, I argue that we should not be any less critical of our spaces of the future, but more aware of our own conceptual, political, and personal limitations as these critiques continue to emerge. As I have suggested throughout this chapter, it is incumbent on all of us, researchers, cultural critics, designers, operators, consultants, and guests, to appreciate and express the nuance, complexity, and ambiguity inherent in the idea of immersion. We must jettison the simplistic view of the concept as, metaphorically, some sort of on-off switch, as well as leave behind the related dualisms and simplifications such as authenticity, as they only prevent us from acting on the warp and woof, the true nuances of immersion. We should reflect this complexity in our research papers and our personal enthusiast blogs, in our design schema and our training curricula. And we should all generally approach immersive spaces with open, honest, and reflexive sensibilities. There are no fail-safe switches of the sorts found on the fictional holodeck, and thus it is impossible for any of these parties to immunize itself from whatever negative effects might be the outcome of immersion and its various modalities and conceptual implications. As well, in terms of the design side of themed and immersive spaces, we should consider new approaches to the immersion of guests in space. I do not intend this as an argument about new and innovative spaces, but rather a push to combine these more complex understandings of immersion with a deeper appreciation of the conceptual and existential opportunities of using new and cutting-edge design to alter the phenomenology of immersion. Contemporary venues like those of the pavilions at World Expo 2015 in Milan remind us that the emerging technologies of virtual and augmented reality, conceptual and postmodern design and architecture, and new approaches to presenting history, self-other concepts, and cultural meaning need not be used as simple, awe-inspiring moments, nor, ironically enough, as means of better immersing the guest in space. Rather, taking cues from the most innovative and tricky of contemporary spaces, notably here, Dennis Seaver's house in London, the Museum of Jurassic Technology in Culver City, California, Juan Pueyo's corporate headquarters and McDonald's Tribute Museum in San Bernardino, California, Tio's Tacos in Riverside, California, Robbers Roost Ranch Antiques and Collectibles in Inyokern, California, and the DDR Museum in Berlin, Germany. We may use new design approaches to inspire doubt, existential anxiety, feelings of complicity, middle voice experiences, and even meta-immersive potentialities in the spaces of the future. Immersion need not imply simply telling a story or creating a fictive world for the guest to experience. It might instead suggest some powerful unraveling of the everyday world around us. This, the avant-garde potential of Fantasy Island, and its not quite realized critique of the relationship of the real and the simulated. We must also reorient the experiences, roles, and sensibilities of guests within themed and immersive space. The notions of guests being passive, robotic, and non-agentic in consumer space are fortunately beginning to pass, and in their place are new and expressive understandings of the complex, active, and creative roles that guests play in the consumer world. Media theorist Henry Jenkins has spoken of media convergence, in which users of media become more active creator agents of media. As well, The research in themed living communities, such as those of Civil War reenactment, themed avocational groups, such as the Tribes of Cologne, LARPs, or live-action role-playing, such as Darkon, and experimental life fiction games and experiences like the Jejune Institute and Dismaland, all provide ample grounds on which to build greater involvement, participation, and indirect and direct dialogue of guests in the spaces to come. The spaces of the future will, no doubt, be highly immersive. Yet the nature and stakes of that immersion is in all of our hands. Let us then suspend our disbelief, at least for this moment and a few more to come. Thank you very much.